Alright, so we have been talking about this the resilience review, and we said that the resilience review is based on 10 domains of cyber security that needs to be taken care of by the organization in order to be resilient. And as I said, that the resilience is the property of getting back to normalcy after cyber crisis or after some kind of a cyber incident, and your ability to do that as quickly as possible is kind of the measure of your resiliency. And the question is, of course, one could argue that we should do this and that and the other in order for to be considered resilient. In fact, right now as we speak in the Bureau of Indian Standards, we are working on a resilience standard, right? And there has been a lot written about resilience in the literature, in the in the various organizations such as NIST and Homeland Security and so on, but still there is resilience. The term resilience is sort of like often misunderstood, and often people confuse it with reliability, and the reliability is about your ability to work when there is a planned incidents. So when we design a system to be reliable, we already know what can go wrong, and accordingly we figure out what is the probability that my system will not work or will fail to do the service in the face of those problems, the problems that I might have already imagined or modeled. And then that probability, based on that probability, we said this is the reliability. For example, we often require that you have to have 4-9 reliability, which means that it has to be 99.9999 percent probability that it will work irrespective of certain problems. Resilience, on the other hand, is for unplanned, unexpected situations, and the question that one has to ask is that under unexpected, unplanned circumstances, what can we actually remain sort of in service, maybe in a reduced capacity, in reduced quality of service, but I should be able to then recover as soon as this problem goes away. And then the question of course is that what are the things that as a cybersecurity team or the party responsible for cybersecurity of an organization, what should be done for the organization to be cyber resilient, right? So according to this RMM, the resilient maturity model, they decided that these are the 10 different domains in which we will be having certain goals, right? So these goals, if you fulfill these goals completely, and then you have to check whether these goals are being fulfilled in a planned way or in unplanned way, whether the goals fulfillment is kind of ad hoc or whether it is actually under the support of the management, whether the methods for fulfilling the goals are being reviewed to see whether the goals are actually being met, this kind of stuff. So based on those things will define the maturity level. So we'll see very soon what that means. So here you see that we have like 4 columns here, and in these 4 columns this is the number of goals. So per domain I have or their model has this many goals in each of these cases, and number of practices associated with this goals. So like last time in the class we actually looked at some of the goals, one goal at least for the asset management, and the goal was that the services are identified, that is the organization is providing some service or set of services, or it has certain services that are externally facing, customer facing, and certain services that are internally facing. For each of the services I have to identify the assets associated with the service. So that was one of the goals in asset management that we looked at, and then we saw the questions associated with each of these goals. So, we looked at couple of questions. So, we will go into a little more details today, but there are 30 across these 7 goals, there are 30 practice questions, that is, do you do this or do you do that, this kind of stuff. And then there are 13 what we call the maturity indicator level practices. MIL stands for maturity indicator level. So, each of these have 13 maturity indicator level practices, and they actually are same set of questions for each of the domains. So, we will look at that. So, the domains that we are interested in, to see whether asset management, if we have proper asset management in the organization, we want to look at whether the controls are and here we, by controls we mean cyber security controls, like perimeter security, whether we have endpoint security, whether we have a proper authentication, we have proper authorization, whether network is segmented. These are controls. So, we want to see whether the controls are managed properly. Then we want to see whether configuration is properly managed, because software and hardware or operating system, etc., if you do the wrong configuration, you may not be secure even if you have the right set of tools and technologies. So, configuration and change management. So, whenever there is a change, are we doing it in the right way, right, so that it does not expose the organization to further risk. Vulnerability management, do you actually routinely check for vulnerabilities and do we actually fix those vulnerabilities in time, etc. Incident management, how do you respond to incidents? Whenever there are cybersecurity incidents, do you actually manage those in a reasonable way and reasonable time? Service continuity management, so how do you make sure that your services continue to be there for customers as well as internal users even when there are cyber incidents? Risk management, do you actually do risk assessment, risk management, etc., risk driven cyber security? Now, external dependencies management, this is very important, because in external dependencies are basically third party vendors and supply chain and various contractors and so on and so forth, who actually come into your organization or access your organization or provide products into your organization. You want to make sure that you check the cyber security of them, because lot of attacks come from supply chain or through contractors or through vendors having access to your network. Whether you do the training and awareness, this is very important, because we have been saying this repeatedly that cyber security is about people, process and technology. So, people part is very, very important. So, in case you have the best security, but your users are not trained and they fall for social engineering, they actually click on a malicious link and so on, your whole security is actually might actually be useless if a virulent attack takes place when the user gets socially engineered. Now, of course, in a resilient system, even if the user gets socially engineered, it should not happen that the entire system collapses, but it can do some harm. So, we have to focus on training and awareness. And then the situational awareness, this is where the security operations center, the security incident and event management tools, the network monitoring, the network, the endpoint monitoring, all these things come into situational awareness. We want to understand on a real time basis what's happening inside my network, inside my endpoints, and accordingly how the users are behaving with respect to trying to log into things that they are not supposed to log into, whether they are trying to access file system that is not supposed to be accessed by them, whether they are trying to get into a database that they are not supposed to be, or and things like that. So, this is situational awareness. So, we will go into the details of each of these goals and the number of the practices and the MILs. MILs are actually common across all these domains. So, we will go through the MILs once. So, now the way I have decided to do this is my slides will have basically a very abridged version of all these different goals and the different practices. practices related questions, but I will go into the actual document to show you some of the goals and practices to get you idea about how to think about them. Now, in this context, as I already mentioned that National Institute of Standards and Technology, they actually came up with this in 2018, they came up with this NIST cybersecurity framework or CSF. The initial version was 1 and then the version 1.1 came up. Right now as we speak, to a few days ago, last week I think they released the version 2.0, but we will not talk about version 2.0 because here we are talking about this the resilience maturity model, which is based on risk CSF version 1.1. Now, of course, NIST framework is not a easy document to read unless you know a lot more about cybersecurity, but just to give you an idea about what NIST cybersecurity framework says, it basically gives people an idea, a way of thinking in terms of how to organize cybersecurity in their organization, right. So, because otherwise what may happen is that if you have not been trained in cybersecurity and you are an IT person and you are told, and many this is happening in India also, that regulators often say to organizations that you have to have a CISO, right, Chief Information Security Officer. Now, if you are asked suddenly to do a CISO, to find a CISO, there are not as many people in India who are competent, or not in why India only, I mean anywhere in the world, there are not enough competent people to have very well trained CISOs in every organization. There are, of course, banks and all pay a lot of money to the CISOs, so the CISOs are, the best CISOs will now go to banks and maybe stock exchanges or stock brokerage and all that stuff. But if you think in terms of CISOs required in various manufacturing organizations or various especially smaller or medium scale organizations or ports, for example, or things like that, you won't get that many well trained CISOs. Now, so if you are, and this is the problem in the US also, especially this CSF activity started in 2013 with a presidential executive order by President Obama, that basically as a fallout of Stuxnet worm. Stuxnet was the worm that was used to basically harm the nuclear enrichment facility in Iran. So, they realized that this critical infrastructure security is going to become very big in the coming years, which it has. So, now they said, okay, fine. So, how do the critical infrastructure companies, especially in the US, there are more than 1,000 power companies who are very, very small. They supply power in one municipal region or things like that. So, the question is that how do they wrap their head around what to do in terms of cybersecurity. So, what the NIST framework came up with is saying that, okay, so first thing you have to do is that you have to implement 5 different functions. So, these functions they called identify, protect, detect, respond and recover, right. Then they said, okay, so but not every organization are equally risk prone, because if it is a small mom and pop shop compared to a Walmart, you have a very different risk profile. So, therefore, you have to have different implementation tier. You do not necessarily have to have the same level of sophistication of implementation of all these 5 functions. So, that is where what the implementation tiers were created. And then they have this notion of profiles. So, profiles basically distinguishes one sector from the other. So, for example, you can have a profile for banking sector and another profile for oil and gas sector, another profile for maritime sector, for ports and other things. The reason these profiles are different is because cybersecurity in BFSI sector is quite different from a power generation facility or a power transmission facility. So, you have to do this profiles based on what sector you are serving. So, we will not go so much into the profiles, but we will say a little bit about this function cores. So now in the NIST CSF 2.0, there is actually there are 6 functions. There is something called govern, cybersecurity governance, but we'll stick to this one. So here you see the governance was part of identify in the version 1.1. So identify, so asset management, like identifying what cyber assets do you have in your organization, including network devices, applications, firmware, hardware, everything, and figuring out what patch version they have, what kind of vulnerabilities they have, etc., is very important. So the asset management, you have to identify assets, you have to identify the business environment, and this basically has to do with the risk assessment, because the kind of business you are in, what kind of services you are providing will decide, what is your risk, what is your what are the possibilities of threats and so on. Governance was part of identify. So governance is about having a CISO, having a team under CISO, and who is responsible for what kind of activity in terms of security. Having a cybersecurity policy for the organization, which actually is implemented and enforced, so that people actually have to abide by the policy, and if the policy is violated, then there will be penalty. So this kind of things is part of governance. Risk assessment, as you have seen before, risk assessment is very important, and then if you do risk assessment, you have to manage the risk, you have to do whatever is required to identify whatever is required to manage the risk. And then also supply chain risk management, this is the third party risk management. These are actually things that you have to implement in identify. So even to implement identify, you see you have to do a lot of work, and it requires a lot of different skills and employees and tools and technology. Then once you have done this, now you have to think in terms of protection. So first line of protection is access control. You do not want a random person to log into your system or get into your system. So access control is very important. So initially you would want to do this with authentication and authorization. Then you want to actually also make sure that even if you have login into your system, doesn't mean that you have to have access to every resource. You may have different segments of the network, so that you do not necessarily have access to every resource that you have inside your organization. Of course, awareness and training is a important part of protection, because if your users are not aware of various threat models, what can happen, social engineering, what not to access, what not to do, etc., then you might have a problem. So this is part of the protection. Data security is about encrypting the data at rest, encrypting data in motion, all that stuff. Information protection processes and procedures, this is where the various processes and procedures that are followed for information protection. This might actually include things like, for example, you have to shred, like if you print out an important document, you have to shred it instead of throwing it in the garbage can. That will also be part of the implementing this. So cybersecurity is not necessarily always about technology, it might actually be something like a process or procedures. So if you are found to have thrown away a document that is critical or marked confidential in the garbage can, then you will be violating a process or procedure. Maintenance is important, because without maintenance your systems will become old and unpatched, and then they will have threat, they will have attack surfaces. And then other protective technology, which may include firewalls and antivirus and network intrusion detection and so on and so forth. So this is protective technology is only a part of protect. So we often think that, okay, so I have firewall, I have antivirus, so I am protected. Protective technology, those things are only a minuscule part of the entire protect function. So you can see the importance of all these different other things. Now the next thing is that, as we always say, that the attacks will happen irrespective of whether you actually give the best protection as possible. So therefore, you are going to have to detect, you have to always be ready to detect continuous monitoring of your organization, what we call situational awareness there. So you have anomalies and events, you have to look for anomalies and events in the network packet stream, you have to look at anomalies and events in the endpoints, that is in the servers and applications and so on, and you can probably get them from the logs, right. So you have to do log analysis. So this is the continuous monitoring, so you cannot just do a log analysis at the end of the day or next day or something, you have to do continuous monitoring, and there are detection processes that you have to properly put in place and define. Now given that you are going to detect, sometimes you will detect an incident, many times you will have incidents. So you have to have a response functionality implemented, which include the pre-planning of how to respond to what. So there is usually incident response playbook. So there is usually a very elaborate document which actually is called a playbook, and it might have for every type of scenarios, every type of incidents, what needs to be done, when it needs to be escalated, who to inform, etc., etc. So that requires communication. We discussed this communication part in the crisis management. So communication becomes very important for regulatory reasons. You may have to inform CERT-in within 6 hours. You may actually also have to inform your regulator. You may actually have to inform your stakeholders or the community that is using your system and services. Like Microsoft is now going through this Russian hack right now, and you see that they have communicated that to the rest of the world, right. So analysis, you have to do basically forensic analysis of what happened or what is happening, right, and then you have to see whether you can mitigate it right away, right. So do something right away, like for example disconnect certain compromised systems from the rest of the system. And then you have to also respond, part of the response is that, okay, so this time incident happened, this time maybe I could not mitigate it, but I should be able to improve for the next time. So that's the improvement part of the response. So recover is also similarly like, in case your system is compromised and your services are down or services are, the quality is reduced, then you have to eventually recover from that, right, and recover as soon as possible. So recovery planning, so this plan has to be done much before actually incident happens. There should be again playbooks for recovery, right. So and then you should first time an incident happens, your recovery might not be very fast. So you have to be able to do the improvements later on to see whether next time if this happens, how would you recover faster. And then communications related to recovery, when you recover, how long it takes while you are recovering, keeping every stakeholder informed and so on and so forth. So this gives you a very, very quick and bird's eye view of what the NIST framework 1.1 functions are. So, but remember, identify, protect, detect, respond and recover are the 5 functions, and then it talks about the implementation tiers. So as I said that the implementation of this 5 functions may not be possible in every organization to the fullest extent, right. So for example, in some organization it may be like some ad hoc things, like for example I have firewall, I have single factor authentication, I have maybe some systems are in different network, but majority of the systems are in the single network. I may have little bit of endpoint detection like through antivirus, but I do not have a SIEM tool or I do not have a SOC. So I would call that a partial. So here the idea is that the organization is kind of waking up to the idea of cybersecurity and they are trying to do certain things, but they are not doing it in a risk informed way. Risk informed way, it means that here we are trying to do certain things, but risk informed would mean that I have done a risk assessment, I have done a detailed risk assessment, and based on what assets are in the highest risk category, I will put the highest level of security there. I will do the most of the I will put most of my activities around that risk areas, and other areas I can do less. Partial on the other hand is not risk informed. So, partial might actually unnecessarily do things to part of the system which is least risky, right, because I am basically flying blind, I do not have any idea which assets are at the highest level of risk. So, risk informed is better than partial. Now, repeatable is the next tier. Next, repeatable means that not only I am doing it in a risk informed way, I have such good documentation and I have such good process and procedures in the organization that if the organization opens a similar facility elsewhere, I should be able to just take whatever I have done in this facility and put it there, and I will have a pretty good security. So, repeatability requires very good documentation, very good process and techniques, everything has to be properly documented and properly reviewed, and then and repeatedly and also kept up to date, because threat landscape changes, which means that my process and procedures would change over time. So, repeatable would require that not only everything is documented and well managed, but also it is reviewed on a regular basis, so that next time I go to a different facility and do the same thing, I do the latest technology and latest methods and procedures. Adaptive is a little bit highest level of highest tier, where you are actually adaptive to organizational changes, adaptive to threat landscape changes. So, you can actually do things in a very not only are repeatable, you can actually adapt to various unexpected things. For example, if your company merges with another company and that company's cybersecurity level is not as good as yours, adaptive would actually bring the other part of the organization in the right level of security, which you wouldn't do if you are not adaptive. So, you have to then re-plan everything. So, this is what these are the implementation tiers. So, we saw two things. One is the functions, 5 functions, or in the latest version 6 functions, and then there are 4 tiers. Now, you have to see where if you are a small mom and pop shop, and you have little bit of IT to scan the items and keeping inventory and little bit of of course payments and everything online, you might be okay with a partial for a while, right? Whereas if you are a little bigger organization, you may want to be risk informed, and then if you want to if you have an organization with multiple different facilities and so on, you want to be repeatable. And if you are going to be a very large organization with a lot of dynamism, then you want to be adaptive. And as I said that there are also the NIST CSA profiles. Profiles is basically talks about a particular implementation scenario. So, profiles will be different for BFSI sector and the banking and financial sector basically, and then it might be different from in the power sector, it will be different from maritime sector and so on and so forth. So, we will not worry too much about the profiles. So, now coming back to these domains. So, we already saw what the domains are. So, we are going to actually use these abbreviations. So, for example, situational awareness I am calling SA, and asset management as AM, and service continuity management SCM, and so on and so forth. So, now in the slides I have these things kind of summarized, and I will show you the actual document. So, asset management, so obviously every domain has a purpose. Asset management domain's purpose is to identify, document and manage assets during the life cycle to ensure sustained productivity to support critical services. Now, you see that in this purpose nowhere it says anything about security, right. The reason is that see, the security is at the service of business continuity, at the service of what the organization does. Security cannot be your main thing, So when you do asset management, you want to actually make sure that when you commission the asset, like when you actually buy the asset till the time you have retired the asset from the organization, it has to provide service such that you get productivity out of it for critical services, right. So that makes sense, right. I mean, it does not have to be anything to do with cybersecurity, except that the fact that this goal may be hampered by a cyber attack, right. So that's why I have to worry about cybersecurity. So it's basically this domain establishes a method for the organization to plan, identify, document and manage its assets. So you have to actually identify, document. So you have to have a proper asset inventory, right. And then you have to manage the assets throughout its life cycle. So you have to know when it needs to be patched, when a vulnerability is reported, you have to know when it has to be upgraded and so on and so forth. Assets are the raw materials that services need to operate. So assets are basically in the service of the business, right. Assets are not by themselves the most important thing. It is like, for example, this laptop is there for me to actually create the slides to teach you, not just, it's not like I need the laptop for the laptop itself, right. I need it for some activity. So now we know that assets, we have seen this in the risk assessment module, that assets could be people, information, that is data, technology and facilities. So physical facilities like data center, for example, is an asset, right. So you have these 4 types of assets: people, information, technology and facilities. So it should be AM, asset management goals here. So asset management, so we looked at this earlier. We said there are 7 goals of asset management. Now you might say that why not 8 goals or why not 6 goals? Now this is something that after a lot of deliberations, people who came up with RMM came up with these 7 goals. They hope, or they kind of convince themselves that these are the different 7 goals that kind of takes care of all I want to check in the asset management domain with respect to resilience, right. You might actually disagree and you might want to split one of these into 2 goals because you think they actually have 2 different ideas, or you might actually say that I want to add a new goal or things like that. So, but as far as this one is the RMM is concerned, so first thing we looked at this last time, services are identified and prioritized, right. So I have all the services of the organization, whatever services it provides has to be identified, and whichever service is more important with respect to the business continuity, with respect to the bottom line, needs to be prioritized. So I need to know that these are the services I cannot let go down, and these are the services maybe for some time if it goes down I don't care, or I care but not so much. Assets are inventoried and the authority and responsibility for these assets is established. So every asset has to be part of a database called asset inventory. So there should not be any asset that is not known, and then you have to know who is the owner of that asset, including applications. Usually in a large organization, every application has an application owner and a custodian who has the responsibility, who is a custodian of the asset. So that has to be properly documented in the asset inventory. Shouldn't be the case that some asset is lying around, nobody knows whose it is and why it is there and so on. Like it happened in a UP bank like couple of months ago, that some cyber criminals, they came in, connected a laptop to one of the open ports, DHCP ports. They got an IP address and then they were in the network. And then they got hacked into the core banking and siphoned off money. And for days and weeks, nobody noticed that there is a laptop connected to one of the DHCP ports in the main front of the bank, and the attackers basically connected got the DHCP address and then went and remotely accessed with RDP to the bank, right. So here you have an asset which is connected to your network, you have no idea where it is, right. That means there is no monitoring of the assets. Now relationship between assets and the services they support is established. So you should know which asset is involved in what service, because that will help you. See, here you are saying that I have prioritized my services. I know which service is most important, which service is less important. Now if I know which asset is in which service, then I can also accordingly prioritize the assets, right. I can say this asset is at the service of the most important service, so it is an important asset. The asset inventory must be managed, that is, the asset inventory should not be like it is a Excel file and then regulators come for audit and you show, they ask you for asset inventory, you give them an Excel file, but you do not update that Excel file regularly, you do not automate the patches and all that stuff from the asset inventory, then it is not good, right. So you want to have a managed asset inventory. Now also access to assets is managed, right. So depending on the priority of the asset, some assets may be only accessed by a very high privilege users and some may be accessible to anybody. So you have to decide, you know, which asset should be accessible by who and accordingly manage the access. The information assets, that is data, are categorized and managed to ensure the sustainment and protection of critical service. So information assets are data basically. So certain data is very important for operation, certain data is important because it is customer personally identifiable data. In any case, you have to categorize the data and then manage, make sure that data is available and protected. And then facility assets supporting the critical service are prioritized and managed. So here we are talking about cyber assets including software, hardware, firmware, etc., network assets and so on. Here we are talking about data assets, right, and here we are talking about facility assets, so data center for example. So for example, if a data center has important critical service running in that data center, then that has to be properly prioritized and managed compared to, for example, a data center that is not, or a server room that is not running important services for the organization. So now there are 7 goals, which are 7 goals, and then these 7 goals there are questions that needs to be answered which we call practices. So for example, to identify, that is to identify services, this goal will be checked against these 4 practices. So these practices are like organization services are identified, services are prioritized based on analysis of potential impact if services are disrupted, the organization's mission, vision, values and purpose including organization's place in critical infrastructure is identified and communicated, and the mission, objective and activities are prioritized. So this is what we discussed last time from the actual document. So if the answer to all of this is yes, then we will say that this goal is met. If some of them is no, then this goal has not been met. So and then if some of them are yes and some of them are incomplete, that is we do some of it but not really fully, then also this goal is not met. So this particular maturity model is also winner takes it all. So if unless all 4 are yes, we say that this goal is not met, right, or if all of them are incomplete, then we say this goal is incomplete, right. So that is one of the problems with this model I have, is that sometimes some of this might be incomplete and still you may have a pretty good maturity, but this guy will not give you good maturity, it will give you incomplete. So similarly, if we go through this inventory thing, so you say assets that directly support critical service are inventoried, right. So it's basically say, remember the goal was that assets are inventoried and custodians and ownership has been established for every asset, right. So here we basically are saying that assets that directly support critical service are inventoried. Asset descriptions including protection and sustainment requirements, like how do you protect this asset and how do you sustain this asset. Owners and custodians are documented, physical location of the assets are documented, and organizational communications and data flows are mapped and documented in the asset inventory, like how the data flow happens. This is very important in terms of risk assessment and so on. So, because some asset may be dependent on some other assets and so on. So, this is the inventory practices. Then you have to say how the assets and services have to be related to each other. So, association between assets and service are documented, and confidentiality, integrity and availability requirements are established for each service related asset, right. So, if an asset, for example, if you have a laptop for somebody who is sitting at the reception, for example, that asset may not require much confidentiality, maybe confidentiality, but not so much about availability, for example, right. So, that kind of decision you have to document, right. So, which asset requires what security properties. The next goal was that managed inventory. So, inventory is managed, that is whenever there is a change in an asset or new asset is included, then that has to be put into the asset description, and asset descriptions are updated when changes occur. So, inventory has to be managed, it cannot be left untouched after initial creation of the asset inventory. It has to be continuously updated as per the asset changes. The managed access to asset inventory, right. So, access to assets is granted based on the protection requirement. So, if some assets may be a server that is part of your most critical service, you can only give access to that asset to a privileged user, right. And then access requests are reviewed and approved by asset owner, right. So, if I am in charge of this particular server, I should be able to review who is giving a given access. I should not be like some random other person may not give him an account on that server. The privileges, so you can have high privilege access or low privilege access. So, privileges are reviewed to identify whether there are excessive or inappropriate privileges. Like for example, in IIT most people use their laptop and computers with the administrative privilege, right. In a company that will never happen, right. So, administrative privilege is only given to very few people in the organization, right. So, if you need to install a software, you have to ask the system administrators, you cannot just willy nilly install some software. Now, what is good about that is that a malware that you have downloaded from being socially engineered cannot run in a privileged mode, cannot run in administrative mode, and can that way reduce harm. But on the other hand, it also is annoying, because in order to install a software, you have to ask the system administrator, who will actually then have to determine the risk, document it, that I am signing off on that risk before they actually install that software on your system. So, access permissions are managed incorporating the principle of least privilege, that is whichever person needs to really need this asset will only be given that privilege access. Access permissions are managed incorporating the principle of separation of duties. So, different people have different roles in the organization, and then you have to take that into account to see whether you need to give privilege access or access at all. And identities are proved before they are bound to credentials, and so this is where you get this, you might do a Aadhaar based proof, or you might give some kind of a proof to actually know that this is really that person, that whom you are giving access. Now, the other goals, I want to quickly mention a few things, because it can take forever. So, categorized, right. So, the assets, this is information asset, data assets, right. So, they have to be categorized, right. So, what is top secret, what is confidential, what is common knowledge, whatever, right. So, then high value information assets have to be backed up and retained. Guidelines for properly disposing of information assets. So, whenever you are done with a machine, you do not just throw away the or sell the hard disk to a random person, right. You have to write zeros and ones many times on the hard disk, the scrubbing, what you call scrubbing, you have to do all that. So, asset disposal guidelines are to be monitored and enforced, this kind of stuff. So, this is all about data protection and how do you protect the data. And here we are this goal, if you remember, was about facility assets, right. So, facility assets have to be prioritized, which facility, which data center, which server room, which factory floor in case of manufacturing or power generation facility have to be properly protected with physical access protection, right. And which facilities are high priority, etc., has to be reviewed and validated, and protection and sustainment requirements are considered during the selection of the facility. So, some facilities may be not related to your important business services, you may not worry about that, but if something is hosting assets, some physical facilities hosting assets that are very important for your critical services, then you want to protect it by lock and key and access control and so on, and video cameras, etc., so that you know that it is not being accessed by some random person. So, that is basically what we saw in the in this one, right. So, this is asset management has these 30 practices that must be done in order to be considered a mature asset management in the organization. So, we will talk about control management tomorrow. We may not go through all the 10 domains, you can easily read it once you actually gotten an idea about how to go about reading these goals and the practices, but it will give you an idea about if you were to work in an organization and you are asked to actually think in terms of what will make the organization resilient. You have to think about these different domains, you have to think about these goals and practices, and that is what the whole idea of studying this is to understand resilience and what resilience is all about and what you need to do to be resilient with respect to this model. Of course, there may be a different model of resilience in which some of these things will be different, but this as far as this model is concerned, this is what you need to know and worry about to think in terms of resilience. Okay, all right.